let's go to our seats now, since you can come afterwards and look at it some more, I hope, if you'd like. I'd like somebody to tell me what they saw when they were at the far end of the room. Anybody sort of tell me what it looked like when they were far away?
Looked like a hurricane to me.
Looks like a hurricane. Anybody else?
Looked like a valley to me.
Looks like a valley. Anyone else?
Looked like a lot of stuff going down the drain.
Like black stuff going down the
And
drain.
bats.
Okay. Yes, Chris.
But very just two-dimensional and not as textured.
Okay.
Like an actual painting.
Like an actual painting.
Yeah, whatever the texture is.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Angry mountains.
Angry mountains.
More on the left than the right.
Okay. But you all sort of saw a scene, didn't you? Mm-hmm. You know, for everyone, when you got far away, you saw something that had a unity, that looked like a painting, that looked like a scene. And what happened when you came close?
All the texture.
Okay, Bridget.
You start to see all the texture and the overlaying drawing
Uh-huh.
pieces.
You see pieces. Anybody else want to? Ruth, you had something. I saw your hand go up.
The individual pieces were very interesting to me. The girl with the hand and back of her hair, the colors, the fabric pieces that I had no inkling of that were there.
Right. So you got close and you saw it deconstructed.
Yes.
It became something that was no longer this unity of a scene, but became paper bag from Trader Joe's, and it became some pieces of naugahyde, and the figure of the child, pieces of wallpaper. So you were, when you came close, you realized that that whole scene kind of deconstructed and became a layer, a jumble of other things that when you got far enough away, you could reinterpret as some kind of a scene. So, do you have any ideas about what that might mean to me as an artist? Why I might choose, instead of painting the scene, because I do know how, why I might have chosen this way of working? Just as you think about what is meaning in art, what kind of meaning might you take out of that way of working? Yes?
I think the pieces are more personal. It's more of a memory piece. It becomes about a person more.
Becomes more personal. That's very interesting. Yes?
I thought two things. I thought that you had a lot of affection for the female character. It was depicted very tenderly.
Yes.
The other one was, I thought that maybe you were interested in layering. And while you can layer in a painting, you have to layer when you're doing a collage.
Yes, that's right. That's all really, really apt. So let me tell you a little bit of the background of this piece. This is actually a little boy, and 46 years ago, Eli and I spent 2 years in what is now Burkina Faso in the Peace Corps. Eli was a Peace Corps doctor, and I was the mother of a 5-week-old child, and then eventually had a project there as well. And Eli took a photo in the northern part of Burkina Faso of a little boy with there's another hand here, leading a man who was blind. And at the time, Eli became very interested in an illness called river blindness, or onchocerciasis, for those of you who have medical backgrounds. And he shot this picture of this little boy, and this little boy, for 46 years, has really spoken to me. And Africa speaks to me. I'll tell you a little bit of my background, besides having been back a few times doing consultations. We have a daughter who was the baby, who was 5 weeks old when we went over. And then when she graduated from college, she went to Cameroon and was there for 4 years and met and married our very wonderful son-in-law, Ousmane Nsangu, who's Cameroonian. And so we're part of a family that is African as well on our son-in-law's side, as well as Eli and my heritage, which is Jewish American. And we actually here have the former ambassador to Senegal and to Nigeria, Ambassador Walter Carrington. And to my great honor, and his family, and Dr. R.S.A. Carrington, and they're very good friends. I'm just thrilled. And we have Kwesi Arthur, who is also from Ghana originally and is a fellow artist. So we do have some Africa represented here, and they immediately recognized what this was because of their own experience as in Africa and as Africans, because RSA is also African, is Nigerian. But anyway, this was an image that really spoke to me, and this child spoke to me. My background is in developmental and clinical child psychology, so children and their issues and their lives has always been a part of my adult life. And in a way, my art is just a continuation of that. Even though what I do now is art, it still is speaking to the things that I care deeply about and is an expression of the things that I care deeply about. And I care deeply about children, and I care deeply about Africa, and I care deeply about my extended African family. So I did a painting of this little boy, and there are pieces of this painting all through here, kind of upside down in places, and they're just sort of remnants of the painting that I did. Needless to say, when I did the painting, I didn't think it turned out very well. So I kind of put it in a drawer, and the wonderful thing about collage is that it gives you a chance to reuse the things that you don't think turn out very well. I always felt that the child still spoke to me. I painted this child with all my heart, and that child was still there in my drawer speaking to me. So when I started to work on this collage, I took that child out of the drawer. Many, many years later, maybe, I've only been working in art for 10 years, so maybe 7 or 8 years later. And he became a kind of focal point for me about what this means. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, what it means is that it's a piece of art. And so I had something I could tear up and I could reuse, and I tore up other things, and it actually started in a class that a few people here know with Joel Janowitz. I don't know that if anyone here was actually in the class where I began this. I think, Linda, you were. And I began it in the class, and then I spent a great deal more time after the class working on it. But Joel Janowitz is a wonderful Boston artist, and he teaches a course on drawing that I have participated in. And he's introduced us to the idea of tearing up things and using that as a kind of basis for creating something akin to a drawing. And there's a lot of drawing in here. It's got drawing with charcoal. I come in with pastel. This, of course, is watercolor. I took that original painting and I actually put it under the faucet and I washed a lot of the paint off. And then I went back with the charcoal in order to really emphasize the pathos and the power of this figure. But the first thing I needed to do was to create a visual image that made abstract sense. In other words, I couldn't just put stuff on and then paste this kid on. I needed to do something that had artistic integrity. And so I spent hours with these various elements from my drawers that I tore apart, and I sort of pasted on or stuck on with some tape so I could take it off if it didn't work. And every time I put something on, I'd stand way back and say, does that work? Is there some place that's boring? Is my eye flowing through? And that's an artist's job. It's to have a pathway for your eye as well as a subject for your mind. And this child got introduced about halfway into that process. And then I basically wove the child in and wove these pieces of collage in. But I was very concerned to keep the integrity of each element. I didn't need to hide that this was a paper bag. It was important to me somehow, instinctively, that this was a paper bag. There's a little piece of blue tape here. Eli said I needed blue there. Eli is filming me right now. And so I took a piece of blue tape and I put it there, and so that's Eli Newberger's contribution. Right there. But I titled this, What Are We Doing, Where Are We Going? And there are some different interpretations of that. One interpretation is that I didn't know where I was going when I began it, and I didn't know what I was doing. And so this is an example of a work, and there are beautiful works in this exhibition, and some of these are works where the artist came to the work knowing just what they wanted to achieve. I came to this work not having a clue what I wanted to achieve. And I experimented and I added and I subtracted until I found something that was working for me abstractly and working for me emotionally as well. But the other part of the what are we doing, where are we going, that is important for me is, and why I chose this medium, which is why I wanted you to look from far back and me to look, and you to look from closer up, is that there's a political message in the medium as well as in the image. Here is a child, you don't know who this child is. This child is in a landscape where, as Ruth said, the mountains seem angry. As Bridget said, it looks like it's going down a hole. I mean, this isn't a comfortable environment for this child. It may work artistically, I hope it does, but emotionally, it makes you uncomfortable for the child. But you don't see that until you get up close. And so when you're farther away, you can construct a narrative that's a much more benign narrative. That this is a child, the child is in a natural environment, it's pretty ambiguous who the child is, where the child is. You can perhaps say this is a very beautiful child, and kind of leave it at that, and not ask any questions about who this child is. And,
or not even see the child.
Or not even see the child because he may just be so integrated into the piece. But as you get closer, that world deconstructs. And one of the reasons why I am now working in more and more in a combination of painting and collage is because collage lets me portray a deconstructing world. And I would argue that in all of our lives, we have unexamined narratives. That when we get closer, we find out that this t-shirt that was probably made in China was made in a factory in which the workers aren't getting enough to eat and getting enough money for their work, or any political freedoms, or or we have food on our plate, and we all remember Cesar Chavez and how he had to fight for the rights of migrant workers, and the battle is still far from being won, but we are happily eating the food on our plate. And so, for me, there's a message in the medium, and the message in the medium is that under our narratives are deconstructions that if we look closely enough, we might find things that fall apart, that make us uncomfortable, that make us question our place in the world. And so I feel that, the choice of a child from Africa is no accident because of my own personal connections, but it's also no accident because of what it is that I'm trying to communicate and the levels on which I'm trying to communicate that in this piece. And then I want to just say one more thing as we come to 3:30, and then I want to hear some of your comments and questions. I named this, What Are We Doing, Where Are We Going? Well, it turns out that there are different paths to creativity, as well as different paths to creating a particular piece of art. And there are some artists whom an economist named Galenson, who wrote a book, Old Masters and Young Geniuses, he did an economic analysis of when in some famous artists' careers their work was at its best. In other words, when did their work peak? And what he found is that there were two distinct paths to creativity. And one was young geniuses, and these were people who really knew what they wanted to do at an early stage either in the genesis of a particular piece or in the genesis of their career, they had the image in their mind, and then they got to their canvas or their medium, and they executed what was already thought of. These are conceptual artists. Roy Lichtenstein, Warhol. There's a number of artists that sort of fall into this category. Then there are artists, and Cezanne is a very, very good example, and the example that Galenson used, who were never satisfied with their work, and whose work was always evolving, and always evolving through the process of making the work. And so he was very reluctant to exhibit his work because he never felt it was done. And it turns out, and these he calls the old masters, and their work peaks later in their lives because their work is continuing to evolve through that process of experimentation. Well, artists who come to art later in their lives, which is true of me after a career in psychology, tend to be experimental artists in that old master. They're already old, so all you have to do is achieve mastery. That old master tradition, and where your work is a process, not a sort of foregone product. And so when I work, whatever the work is that I do, I usually don't know where I'm going when I start. I might have an idea if I'm doing plein air, for example, and I see a scene in front of me. I know I want to really do a great painting of that scene. It very often ends up in a collage, but that's part of the process. But the point that I'm making is that my way of working is really very experimental. I'm kind of feeling my way as I go along and getting ideas that come out of the work itself. And I just wanted to leave you with that because I think that different people work in different ways, and I think it's really, really important to, whatever way you work, to kind of honor it and understand that everyone has their own sort of idiosyncratic way. But mine happens to be that very experimental, learning through the process and never knowing quite where that process is going to take me, and I find it quite engaging and exciting and challenging and sometimes terrifying. So I'm going to stop there and ask if there are questions or comments. Ruth?
I don't know if it's exactly a question, but as a mixed media artist myself, I'm very curious about what's underlying the layers, what other stories are being told that only you know. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me I would add from your piece, who am I, why am I here, where am I going? Mm-hmm. That's inherent also in your piece. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us put our souls there, the ones that come up from our souls and our inner wisdom. Mm-hmm. I learned something from you as an old learner, old artist, mm-hmm. about my art when it emerges is good. And when I have a concept in my head and I try my darndest, like you did with a painting, it just doesn't work.
Right. You have to let something that's inside of you
absolutely
have its own, you have to have the courage to let it come out, to let it be, to not know what it is, and to know that you may totally fail. Arsen.
It's a beautiful piece of artwork, and one of the things I noticed from afar to me was the confusion, something about the confusion we are in the world we are in today. So when I took a glance, it was like so much was happening at the same time, and that, mm-hmm. who am I, where are we going kind of mm-hmm. thing, and the question mm-hmm. we all ask ourselves in part of our confused life. And then, like you said, when I came closer, I began to see different figures. Like, for instance, looking up at the leather piece there, mm-hmm. to me it sort of looks like an animal sort of scavenging in
that
the valley.
Could be the front paws.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I never saw that. That's right. That's great. I never noticed that, but now absolutely. And you wonder, is this a predatory animal
yes.
that's threatening that child?
Yes, exactly.
Any other thoughts or comments?
Flowers
Yes.
seem like hope to me, like you are hopeful and that everything will turn out well, and in the chaos of the whole thing, and the little boy who hope he does well wherever he is.
What a lovely observation. I think that's right for me. You know, I mean, I choose what elements I put in it, and I can also say, having lived in Africa and having so many connections to Africa, that there's so much that is so beautiful as well. So the flip side of the deconstruction of something that looks whole and benign is that sometimes we have preconceptions of a place or of a people that is negative, and when we get close we realize the beauty. So there is that dynamic between that which is hopeful, as you put it so well, and that which is frightening and that which is confusing, as RSA mentioned. I mean, it's wonderful when people see these things in your work, because that means people are seeing things in your work. Anybody else? Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Yes, Quasi.
One thing that came to mind was, it reminded me a little bit of the title of Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart. And also the fact that that comes from Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, where it says, I'm going to paraphrase terribly here, but it says, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot see the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. And your assemblage very much reminds me of that, and it embodies that, and also reminds me a bit of some of Mahler's music. Also, I think in Symphony No. 2, you know, where the Farajaka motif.
Yes.
Also, where
Symphony No. 1.
Symphony No. 1.
Oh, Symphony No. 1. Thank you.
It's a tuba solo.
Right.
He's a tuba player, for those of you who know.
You know, where the hunters go into the forest and they come back
That's
being
right.
carried by.
Yeah.
And so, just want to say thank you very much, and also wanted to ask you a little bit about what the process of tearing things apart to create another whole, what that.
That's a
feels
really,
to you.
really good question, because there's always a tendency to want to be in control. And for all of us who are artists, we know that if we're in too much control, we usually aren't very good artists. And those of us who are sometimes good artists and sometimes not so good artists, we know that when we're trying to be too much in control, that's when we lose the magic of something that is fresh and intuitive and speaks to people. Tearing can't be very well controlled, and so there are times when I want to take the scissors and I want to draw because I know just where it should be, and I resist that impulse. And I resist that impulse because I feel that I am in conversation with what I'm creating. And so when I tear, when I'm not in control of everything, then there's something that is speaking to me and saying, pay attention, what are you going to do with this now? And so I tear, knowing that sometimes it's not going to come out the way I envisioned, because I just can't control it, and it's rough, and I have to work with it, and I have to speak to it. And so I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's a really important thing for me, is that conversation. The work is talking to me and saying, what do I need now? And so I'm constantly moving back and forth and saying, you know, where am I bored? What needs something to make something whole, you know, or to take my eye on a pathway. And so the tearing, I feel, is much more edgy and dynamic, and it's much more challenging. And I think I get out of it a work that is just more real, more interesting. Yes.
again.
That's because you have so much good to say.
I find it quite courageous of you to leave the paperback handles as they are. As a challenge to me as a found objects artist, we know we're not supposed to let something be what it is. It has to stand for something different. And I think you do that so beautifully here. But it takes courage to allow that and someone to look at it and say, well, that's a paper bag and you left the handle there.
Right.
But it fits into the story.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I hear you saying that I think those of us who are the elderly artists or whatever that we're called.
Old masters.
Oh, thank you. Much better.
Remember that. It's much better.
It does. And that's, I picked from what you said, that you were more concerned about the witness of the painting and what they bring to it than what you're trying to say yourself.
Yes, that's right.
And
I'm
people
learning
are
through it.
responding to all of that.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm making, this is part of my own personal discovery.
Right.
And it's not only the discovery of what is this image going to be, but it's this discovery of who am I? What am I bringing to this? What, do I have the guts to leave the handle?
Yes.
Why? Why would I do that? And I don't always know. I don't always know until something is done why that made sense to me. And it does make sense to me because the part of that deconstruction is what is this world this child is living in. This could be garbage, too, that we haven't cleaned up for him. But again, it's part of the tearing is that it doesn't answer questions, it asks questions. It leads to the asking of questions rather than, this is what I have to say. I don't always know what I have to say, but it's all, for me, a process. It's a process. I guess that's the thing. It's a process. Yes, Chris?
In the spirit of allowing the art, the medium, to kind of dictate what you're doing, do you find that you have a lot of leftover pieces? Or is it?
Well, it's not dictating. We're in a conversation. It's a democracy.
So is it so?
I mean, I do have the glue.
Exactly. Well, that's what I mean. So yeah, there is a lot of choice in what you're doing. But
Oh, all the time.
Did you sit around and say, well, maybe this is not the case, but you only had so much floral wallpaper, and you only had so much of this, and then you did with it, or you had an exorbitant amount of resources and you tore things that you saw? I mean, do you find that there's just a mess of paper when you're finished with the artwork?
There's always a mess.
Or do you use it all?
No, I don't use it all because I do make choices. And there are some things where I have a lot, and there's some things where I don't. And then I have to decide, well, if I have a lot, am I going to use a lot of it? Or I'm going to use that judiciously because I don't need a lot of it. And if I only have a little bit, and it's a precious resource, then I say, okay, how am I going to use this precious resource? And there's always lots of stuff on the floor. And then I put it all back in the drawer because I don't, unless it's just, tiny little bits. I don't usually throw it away because I think I never know, as I rummage through that drawer, it's actually a folder, a big, sort of art folder, and it's where I put all the stuff that will be for my collage, and I rummage, and sometimes my rummaging will speak to me as well. There'll be something in there, a figure that, the legs are great, but the rest of it isn't, and so, wow, I need legs! And so, it's all a conversation in a way. This is telling me things as I move, forward, and what I have is telling me things about what my resources are. It's like life. What the world lets you do, and what you have in order to. You have enough money to buy this, or don't you?
Take one more question.
Well, then I think we're done.
Well, I'll ask one.
Oh, one more question.
Actually, it's not. It's just a statement. The figure of the child with her hand on her head has so much meaning because in Africa, sometimes when a child gets overwhelmed and confused, they just place their hands on their head like this and look down, just, what next? All the questions are flowing through their mind.
That's
And
right.
that's what you kind of have
That's
there.
right.
And
It's
then
a
you have the
very heartbreaking
collage
question.
around it. So sort of throwing all those questions there. And at the same time, like someone else said, hopefully there are also good answers within that collage for the child. So that's what I wanted to add.
Well, thank you so much.
much.